Let's record here. So we'll officially get started. And Adrian has muted everyone here just for the purpose of background noise, not coming through too loudly. But please feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want to chime in and add anything. But I'm really honored to be here with all of you. There are a lot of my relatives who are on this call, and so this is like a kind of a family reunion. And for everyone else who's here, it's we're only a little bit distant from each other by probably one or two circles of distance, but otherwise quite close. So happy to have you all here, and really happy to have David Raphael with us also. He is the CEO and one of the co-founders of the Jewish Grandparents Network, and is a very proud, he's from Atlanta, where he lives with his wife and his beautiful granddaughter, and is really passionate about the role of being a grandparent and what that means, and what that looks like, and all of the opportunities for grandparents today. And I noticed, and I'll just say this, David, at the beginning of your report, there's this great study that was commissioned about Jewish grandparents. And one of the quotes at the very beginning of it is from Lisa Miller, who's one of my favorite authors. She wrote this beautiful book called The Spiritual Child. And in it, she says that very often a grandparent becomes the special spiritual partner who sits and listens to a child's questions and welcomes a child's feelings and has the long, deep talks at the kitchen table. And knowing from the people who are on this call, both grandparents and also great grandparents, there's so many ways in which you serve as that role, and even can grow in your potential as being that for both your children and your grandchildren. And what we wanted to do today is to invite us all into a conversation. Thanksgiving is coming up, and it's kind of an excuse for us to gather together here beforehand. And it's an opportunity when most families really gather together and sit around a table. And I remember my own Thanksgivings growing up at Miriam's table, who's on this call, up in Maine. And there are real opportunities for intergenerational connection and potential closeness, and maybe anxiety and fear about dynamics that might not be so smooth in our lives and in our families. And I'm thinking a lot about this Thanksgiving and what does it mean for us now in this time to be distant. And we've kind of gotten used to this a little bit. We've been in this situation since March, so nothing's new here. But each time a holiday comes around, it's an opportunity to reframe and think a little bit differently. And it also, it kind of, in Hebrew, you say it does like a kvetch belev, like you feel a little bit of like of a twist in your heart. And so I wanted for us to convene together to be able to think about, well, how might we think about and reframe this time of Thanksgiving? And as many of you know, I wrote a book recently that's called Becoming a Soulful Parent, A Path to the Wisdom Within. And in it, thank you. Thanks, Alan. That's what it looks like. And Adrian, thank you for putting it in the chat, where if you wanted to buy a copy, I'd be really honored. And it's, I was moved as a parent, not a grandparent yet, the role that I can play in helping opening up the connections and the possibilities for a deepened relationship. It's kind of like the parents are the gatekeepers between this exquisite relationship between an older generation and a younger one. And I want to read, a short piece from the book, and then turn it over to David to kind of frame his work and what he does as a part of the Grandparents Network, and to help us kind of think creatively about what are some of the ways that we can evoke more curiosity with the other generations, whether it's our children or our grandchildren, And what are the ways that storytelling can become a central part about how we approach this Thanksgiving? And we're going to do a short exercise a little bit later, and then open it up for your questions and your ideas as well. So I just want to read this short piece. It's actually about storytelling. Some of you may have seen one of the ways that we promoted this seminar was in wanting to was in a practice that we're doing with my father, that my sister and I are doing, where we're just asking my dad to tell us stories and stories of his life at different periods and different pockets. And I'm so overwhelmed by how many stories you have, that everybody here on this call has. Stories of difficulty, stories of resilience, stories of love, stories of kind of figuring out who they are and what your passion is. And those are such exquisite things to be able to pass on and be able to think about how. So I just want to read you this short piece, which is about some of the characters who are on this call, about storytelling and about the encouragement of us telling stories. And it's from a chapter on grandparents. It's called, the beginning of it is actually a task that we want to ask grandchildren to do, which is becoming curious about their grandparents' lives. I notice my parents don't tell so many stories about their own lives to my kids, but the few anecdotes they do share evoke and stimulate the sensory imagination. For instance, my father has a memory of his father washing his hands. It's a simple memory, yet it speaks volumes about how much my dad admired his father and his salt of the earth ways. My father, now gray with age, still has a boyish manner. He laughs easily and heartily and has a mischievous glimmer in his eye. I am moved that all these years later, when I ask him about his father, he remembers himself as a young boy, standing at the sink to wash his hands before dinner, reaching his father's waist. His mother is wrapped as always in an apron, her thumbs blackened by the stain of the root vegetable she is holding steady, ready to be chopped. My father is positioned next to his father, transfixed by the steady stream of water and soap as it flows over those rough and wrinkled and sturdy hands. He talks about those moments as ones in which he felt security and unqualified admiration for his father. As my father grew older and took over the family business, contention and healthy disagreement entered their dynamic. The storyteller chooses which stories to tell, and the meaning is made in the telling. When my father shares these anecdotes, my children and I are transported to another time. A rich image of my grandfather emerges. I appreciate my grandfather differently now, years after his death. I didn't feel as if he really cared for children. To be honest, I was quite sassy back then when we were growing up, and while we weren't close. My father's recollections are from the perspective of a young boy who adored his father and noticed everything about him. Our children, watching us go about our own daily lives, will most likely remember these small moments too. There's really so much in stories and in storytelling, and this is the time, right? This is the time, especially now, especially over Zoom, especially in these days when we might feel a little bit more apart and a little bit more lonely, as all of us do at every generation, children, parents, grandparents, to be able to kind of weave in and weave together some of the stories of our lives and share them with others, could be a real gift. So I want to invite David, after that very long introduction. I want to invite David to think a little bit and share a little bit with us about your own work, about what you're finding. What are some of the ways in which we can really develop more closeness between grandparents and parents and grandchildren? What are you finding, and what are you hearing from grandparents also in terms of their needs, and how we can augment their position in our lives now, especially now?
I'm really much easier to listen to when I'm muted. So I want to focus on COVID, the context of COVID-19 as a frame um, that I think provides some guidance or some thoughts around the role of grandparents and families. So the Jewish Grandparent Network seeks to engage and support and elevate grandparents as essential members of our families and transmitters of Jewish values in a changing time. And what we're seeing during COVID is some kind of that being exemplified in very intriguing ways. You know, one of my favorite Jewish jokes is that the difference between a Jewish pessimist and a Jewish optimist is that a Jewish pessimist said things are terrible, and they can't possibly get worse. Jewish optimist says things are terrible, but they can always get worse. But that's not what we're finding. We've been doing small group gatherings with grandparents to talk about their experience during COVID. And, you know, we began by talking about how difficult it is. There's this visceral sense of loss that grandparents feel. They want to smell the polkas of their grandkids. They want to play with them. They feel disconnected with them. But then they went to talk about the things that they're doing. And what emerged is remarkable creativity and innovation, that ways that they're exploring new approaches to connecting with their grandkids through Zoom and otherwise. And I'm going to share some statistics with you a little later on that demonstrates the ongoing roles that grandparents play. I want to start out by focusing a little bit. You were talking about memory and the importance of family stories. And you may know of the work of Marshall Duke, the psychologist out of Emory University. Marshall Duke was trying to figure out what created emotional strength and emotional resilience in children, and he couldn't quite figure it out. And his wife, Sarah, who's a school psychologist, said to him, you know, it seems to me that kids who know their family stories are more emotionally resilient. And sure enough, he did a study and discovered that kids who know their family stories, their family narratives, are emotionally stronger, are emotionally resilient. He repeated that study after 9/11 and discovered that kids who had experienced 9/11 and knew their family stories recovered emotionally quicker. And the stories that made the most impact is what he called oscillating narratives. So you think that's our Jewish story. So we struggled in Europe, but we came to America, and we were so poor, but Papa built a business that was so successful, and then the store burnt down. That's an oscillating narrative. And children who know those oscillating narratives are more emotionally resilient, and it makes sense. It's what he calls intergenerational sense of self. My Zaidi, my grandfather, survived the Holocaust. My grandfather came to America and struggled, but he survived. My grandmother raised her 4 kids and she survived. So those kids, those children who know their family stories are more emotionally resilient. And so we do whatever we can to empower and to encourage grandparents to share family stories. And by the way, you don't always share those stories by telling the stories. You share them by baking together, by singing songs. I mean, my daughter sings the songs to my granddaughter that I sang to her, you know, and so we share our stories in very many different ways, and sharing with them the Judaic objects around our house. And so we encourage grandparents very strongly to continue to share family stories and explore new ways of doing that. I would say when we look at the COVID crisis, we look at it as it is a painful and difficult time. And part of what we need to do as grandparents is extract from that the joys, the values that come out of it. This becomes one of the stories that will frame grandchildren's lives. And part of what I think grandparents should be thinking about is how you share and how you save those stories. If you go online, for instance, and you Google COVID-19 time capsules, that a number of different organizations have created opportunities for grandparents to kind of collect memorabilia and draw pictures and write up stories about living through the COVID-19 crisis and put them in coffee cans or cigar boxes if people still have them, and then revisit them in 5 years. Your grandparents, your grandchildren are going to be able to say to their children, I lived through the COVID-19 crisis, and let me tell you about it. So one of the things we've been learning, by the way, about grandparents' roles in the broader family is that we recently did, and Dasee, let me know when I'm running out of time, because I have the capacity to talk at
You're
infinite.
good. I could listen to you. I can listen to you forever. So
Okay.
absolutely continue.
So we did this national study of Jewish grandparents about 2 years ago. That's online, and people should read it. By the way, one of the things we learned is that I want to say 49% of grandparents, maybe it's 47% of grandparents, hadn't done any kind of video communication with their grandkids in the past year. So half of grandparents had no experience with Zoom, no experience with FaceTime. And that has changed dramatically, obviously. Grandparents are adopting, not only are they doing Zoom calls, and one thing is we'd ask you to think about, by the way, in terms of Zoom, how do you make it more interesting? How do you make it more three-dimensional? So when you're engaged remotely with your grandkids via Zoom, just don't talk. Do a walking tour, a discovery tour of your house. Go to your junk drawer. Bake something together, play a game, figure out ways that the Zoom experience can be more multidimensional. But we discovered that in the context of, in a follow-up study, that about a third of grandparents today are assuming additional childcare responsibility for their grandkids in a time of COVID. And about close to 30% of them tell us that their grandkids have spent more than a week with them at a time. And this is pretty incredible. 40% of grandparents are playing an active role in the remote virtual education of the grandkids. 4 out of 10 grandparents are involved in the remote learning programs of their grandkids today. And think about the impact that's going to have in terms of your relationship. Grandparents are really afraid that their relationship with their grandkids is going to wither. Marshall Duke tells us, this is really not the first time people have been isolated. People go away for wars, people go away for extended travel, and grandparents have kids living far away. So the relationship will be sustained, but there are things that you could do even remotely that will sustain that relationship. So part of what we would want to say in the context of COVID is not to be either the optimist or pessimist Jew who says things are horrible, they can't possibly get worse, or things are horrible, but they can get worse, but to say, what opportunities can we create during the COVID crisis? And what opportunities can we create specifically around Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving in America is football and turkey, but it's essentially about gratitude. And it's hard to feel gratitude in the times of COVID, but I would suggest in the context of kind of being mindful or being aware of, think about all the things we can be grateful for during this time, instead of focusing on how horrible it is. And it is, I'm not saying it is not, it is terrible. At the same token, we have seen relationships that have grown. I will tell you a very simple, quick story. So, my granddaughter lives in Baltimore, and we love each other, and it's great. And she spent a month with us this summer, and it was difficult, but it was wonderful. And she began, she used to give us these perfunctory hugs. Well, by the end of her month-long visit, she was giving us full-blown hugs. There was really almost a quantitative difference. I mean, if a hug is a measure of a relationship, that was really a demonstration that something had transpired over the course of time. So I think part of what we would say to you is that grandparents do play essential roles in the lives of our families, and transmitting our family stories is not just fun, it's healthy. It's really good for your grandkids to know their family stories. And by the way, it's not just like those stories of your grandkids. So, what are the stories that I could tell my grandkids? Well, I didn't come over from Russia, and I did, and I didn't fight in the war, but I was at Woodstock, and I lived through 9/11, and I remember the polio vaccine. And so each of us in our own way have important stories that we share that convey, that build that sense of intergenerational sense of self. So I would say even during COVID, and especially around Thanksgiving, figure out ways both to celebrate being a grandparent, and to be to have a sense of gratitude of what an extraordinary opportunity it is. So, people have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I want to say that I just love these ideas, and I love this sense that, what can we be grateful for? It's COVID, like we're living through this pandemic, but I think that there's something that becomes so essential now, like everything is smaller, the opportunities for gratitude actually expand because there's so little that we can do, and how we can connect, and we're not overwhelmed with the bigness of our life, that it actually, requires us to focus on the smallness of our lives. And I think gratitude starts in those small things. Another day to wake up, a warm bed to sleep in, these are very, very basic things that we would say in our gratitude lists at the end of a day. But I think that they're also essential in terms of the qualities of our relationships. And I think I want to just kind of be mindful that as well as the oscillating narratives that we have, they're also oscillating relationships that we have, and there's a dance of closeness and distance. And I think a part of, for us and our work with Ayeka and becoming a soulful parent, this idea that we're always in the process of becoming. Becoming is, it's actually God's name. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs died recently, and I remember him saying about when Moses encounters God in the burning bush, God says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am that I am, is how it's usually translated into English. This is God, this is I am what I am. But in Hebrew, it's really I will become what I will become. And there's an essence or an element of, God's process and becoming in process all the time. And I think that's this model for us of we're in process and constantly in movement, and so are our children, and so are our grandchildren. So I think that, the way that I want to respond, David, to what you're offering and what you've beautifully stated is that there are always opportunities for us to know that things may be different. This Thanksgiving might be a little bit different. I know that I can only control myself and my reactions and my interactions. And for me, this is what's going to be important, is telling these stories, is knowing that these stories of thanks and gratitude and resilience are essential. I also want to just offer us, if you'll kind of go with me on this, I would love for us to take a moment to take everything that we've heard so far about stories, the importance of stories, resilience, the centrality and the role of grandparents in our children's and grandchildren's lives. And I want us to just take a moment to kind of think, and this Ayeka, which is in Hebrew, it's translated as, where am I? Where am I in this? Where am I in my own experience of thinking about, next Thursday, a week from today, and the lead up and this week in between? Where am I in terms of the story, maybe one story that you might want to think about, where you experienced hard-won thanks, let's say, not the simple gratitude of I have running water today, but some kind of gratitude that you felt or you experienced maybe in the past year, maybe in the past 5 years or decade or any time in your life, really, that was gratitude after something that was hard, that was something that was a challenge for you. And then I'll offer that this is kind of a step one of considering sharing that with your children or your grandchildren sometime in this week between now and Thanksgiving. So I want us just to take a minute. If we were all sitting in a room, I'd ask you to write this down, but you don't have to. You can just think about it for a moment. But for everyone, just to take a minute in your beautiful homes and wherever you are, on the couch or the bed or the desk or your den or coffee dining room, wherever it is that you are, just to take a deep breath, kind of consider, where am I in my own storytelling to the next generation? What's a story about hard-won thanks that I'd want to convey? Just take a minute to think, and then we'll come back together. So when you're ready, we'll come back together. And if anyone is willing to share something that they thought of, it doesn't have to be in great detail, maybe just a headline. I'd love to hear from people. We can kind of bolster and support each other in this work that might feel hard or complicated, or might be the easiest thing for us in the world. I'm wondering if anything comes up. Yes, David.
Me?
Well, I just got off the phone with my son who's down in Arlington, Virginia, and he and his wife have an adopted son, Danny, who's from Ethiopia. And for some reason, my son, I have told him this story because he had asked me about something about tuition at the University of Michigan. We got onto, I'm a loyal alumnus of Michigan. And I told him a story that he thought his son, my grandson, would also enjoy, which was that I tell people who ask about my time at Michigan that I played football at the University of Michigan. And he said, you must have gotten squashed. I'm 5'6", and at the time would have been about 120 pounds. But then I tell them that was playing for the Jewish medical fraternity, playing football at the University of Michigan in the intramural league. And then I told them about our first game, which was with the physical education fraternity, the graduate school for athletes who wanted to go get a master's degree. And they were the first team we played. I won't go into the details of that game. But I think it's an intergenerational story that he's looking forward to telling his son about, and I've told other people about. But it's that kind of, I think it's kind of what you're talking about, to share just a simple story like that, because I think people in this Zoom call will understand that Jewish medical students are not known for their football prowess, and so we leave it at that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's just, all these things, they give perspective, it gives perspective, and also the sense that I'm not alone, and whatever I feel about my own physical stature and athletic abilities is genetic. Might be genetic, or might be, it's all in the family. It's all in the family. Beautiful.
Well,
what about other folks? Yeah, David.
I have a story. So when I was young, I had a blood disease. And when I was 29, this is one physician on the call, it was ITP, and I had my spleen removed. And, you know, now they just kind of make a little slit, but back then they made a cut from my belly button to my sternum. And I was just about helpless. I mean, I was in terrific pain, and it was incredibly difficult experience. But two things happened. I became aware of the miracle of our bodies, how remarkable this thing is. It was amazing that a doctor could go in and have that kind of skill to go in and to rearrange my plumbing and sew me back up, and everything would be fine. And then just the kindness of people, you know, the kindness of people, the nurses, the physicians, my wife, who was with me through the whole time. So that's the kind, you know, it was terrible, but at the same time, it was life altering in many, many ways.
Wow. It's often the hardest stories that are the ones that are the most memorable, really. Thank you, David. Yes, Ellen.
And now since I see your dad, who was very influential in our Jewish community for a number of years when he came and talked to us about tzedakah and raising funds for our federation, it made me think of what we just happened just the other day. Our granddaughter's birthday is next week in California. She's going to be 9. So I said, Stuart, we had a present for her, but I also gave her an envelope filled with 9 $1 bills. And I put it in the envelope and I said, Lila, when your mom, our daughter Rachel, when I was at home one afternoon, I was on the phone making calls to Federation, asking for people to make a tzedakah contribution to our Federation, to help feed the hungry, to clothe the needy, and to do all these wonderful things that our Jewish community does. And then I hung up, and then Rachel came over to me and said, but Mom, you didn't ask me. So she went up to her room and she took $3.93 from her birthday money or whatever it was, and she gave it to me. She filled out a card from the Federation, and I called up and I told whoever our director was, I got the best gift in the world, because it was from my daughter, who understood what tzedakah was. So I enclosed this in the letter to Lila, and she'll get it for next week for her birthday. And, you know, hope she will consider to do something also for either the food bank where they live in San Francisco, or for some other, whatever worthy thing that she decides to do, but put it in her hands. And it just happened 2 days ago. So it was very kind. Yep. Timely.
Oh, beautiful. I love the sense also that, you know, for parents to see grandparents as partners in helping, you know, parents are always so busy with like all the stuff of the daily life, you know, and so these bigger, the values, the stories, the experiences that you had, that you can just seamlessly, you know, pass it on. I'm sure Rachel will love that.
She will. And also when she was at college, Rachel was making calls for, they had some sort of a UJA at Brandeis, made some sort of a call-a-thon. And she called me up and said, Mom, I was there. I was on the phone making calls, raising money for tzedakah. And that really really touched me more than anything else she did at Brandeis all those years. So.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. What about for other folks? Anyone else?
My
Yeah,
story emanates with my grandmother. When I was young, I used to collect dimes, mowing lawns and shoveling driveways and stuff. And
Back in antiquity.
way
dimes.
back when, and I used to roll up the dimes. You could have 50 dimes for $5 and a roll of dimes. And instead of depositing them in the bank, I used to take the rolls of dimes and I put them in my drawer. And my grandmother, who was living with us at the time, said to me one day, I'd like to have all your rolls of dimes. And I didn't want to give them to her, but I did, because she was my grandmother and she asked. And the way she taught me was, I used to get notes in the mail from the rolls of dimes that were given to a family in Roxbury for Thanksgiving. Dear Michael, thank you for buying us Thanksgiving dinner. Or a family in Dorchester saying, thank you for buying us Christmas presents for the family, et cetera, et cetera. So that was taught to me by my grandmother. And then obviously, no, I'm not going to show them that. But anyway, it's one of the
Uh-oh.
great lessons that grandparents can teach to their grandchildren about many things, but in my particular case, it was about tzedakah.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Beautiful. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Jill, Dad. Oops. Hold on. I'll just unmute you.
You okay?
Yeah.
Thinking about this, what we're going through with this video recording that we're doing together. And I was thinking one of the real strengths is even on this call, some of us are here with our partners and some of us are not here with their partners. Some because they couldn't make it and others have lost their partners. So I was thinking that even in our call, there have been things that you guys wanted to know more detail about and you were able to ask. And none of us are going to be here forever. So if there are, while we have our faculties, while the neurons, which disappearing by the day, week, month, the year, while they're still working in some sort of a fashion that we think is okay, I think doing this sooner rather than later is going to be a really smart thing for all of us to consider, no matter how you do it, whether it's in writing, whether it be in video, some other way. And to be able to have either your children or grandchildren or whoever
Yes.
be able to ask questions, because when you're not here, all our memories go out the window to quite an extent. And if somebody wants to ask a follow-up or ask a question, it's very frustrating when you don't have people who might know the answer there to give you that the detail, the pupil of how we live our lives.
Absolutely. It's this living legacy, right? How can we record these stories?
So I'm just going to throw in that he didn't want me to show this before because he's not ready to give it out. But Mike has written a book with his stories for the family called Rolls of Dimes.
Amazing.
Great.
Amazing. Michael,
Quite out yet.
we're going to do your book launch next.
Whole new career. Yeah.
Amazing. So let's take a couple more. Kathy, yes, we'd love to hear your story.
Gotta unmute, Kathy.
Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you to David for sharing some ideas about how to not just tell stories with your grandchildren. I have one grandson who loves to hear stories, but the others, it's not quite so much. So I was struggling as you were talking with how could I connect with the rest of them? How could I share a story? But as David, as you pointed out, it doesn't have to be a story. It could be a song, or it could be baking or cooking beside one of them. So
What you've done.
yeah. So I want to say thank you to you for sharing some more ideas about not just verbal stories, but doing things or singing a song. Thank you.
You're welcome. Marshall Duke and he's worth looking up his work, but he talks about, when he talks about stories, he calls them Bubameises. And he doesn't say that pejoratively. It's not because it's the grandmothers who are sharing the stories. It's the mothers and grandmothers who are the primary sharers of stories. And he tells a story that when he was little, he would go to his grandmother, because he did terrible in his math test. And his grandmother said, Marshall, I know how hard it is. Your mother was also terrible in math. She really had a hard time in math. And then when, his brother would go to her and did it terrible on his spelling test, his grandmother said, your mother really struggled with spelling and stuff like that. So, basically, she would shift. It's the grandmother's wisdom to shift the stories and the way of telling the stories based on the child. That's one of the great gifts that grandparents give to their grandchildren. I said, you know, I told him the story of my family. You know, my family legend is that my grandfather was the creator of powdered garlic. And it's a long story, garlic, push cart, whatever. And I told Marshall that story, and I said, you know, I just really don't know whether it's true or not. He said, it doesn't matter. It's the sharing that's important. And, you know, you don't have to like chronicle everything and footnote everything, but share stories as you remember them. And that will make a huge difference in the lives of your grandkids. And share stories in ways that they'll be able to hear it. And maybe it's cooking, and maybe it's talking about football.
Absolutely. It's so true. I would also add pictures, you know, kind of the visual piece. And, you know, it's so important what you're saying, Kathy, that verbal intelligence isn't the only intelligence, and auditory intelligence isn't the only intelligence. When we think about multiple intelligence, there's so many, right? You know, visual and sensory and emotional and spiritual. And for us to be as creative as we can, and also very much ourselves, you know, and the things that we model by what we're doing and who we are. My favorite quote by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who also passed away this year, a giant, you know, a Jewish writer, thinker, compiler of the Talmud. You know, for everyday people, said that the most important thing in if you really want to know how to pass down values to the next generation, the only thing you need to do, and like everyone would listen very closely, like, what's the only thing I need to do? He said, all you need to do is to hang a picture on the wall of your grandparent. That's all you need to do, you know, so that one day your kid is going to walk by and say, who's that guy? Like, who is it? What's going on there? You know, why is he wearing that hat? And the visual stimulation also. And I love that idea, David, of like show, you know, do a tour, you know, the next time you're on a Zoom call with your grandkids, like do a tour of your house, or, you know, show them this like cool thing that you have. And it's appropriate that we started this call with like a fixated on some kind of coin like image, you know what I mean? It got us all really interested in what's this image that we see, you know, that was just like a shift of the camera, but all of that just stimulates our curiosity, you know, of what came before me. And that's the biggest gift that we can give to our kids and grandkids. Are there any more stories that are burning for you? Otherwise, I'll ask David if there are any other comments that he has. But any last story that comes to your mind? So I wanted to open it if there are any other questions that people have to David or to myself, and to ask David, really, you know, are there any, you know, what's the one piece of advice that you've given yourself to make your relationship, you know, what you wanted it to be with your granddaughter? Is there any piece of advice that you gave yourself over these years with all the ups and downs?
Well, there's one thing that I kind of feel strongly about. You know, when after Jacob had the dream of the ladder the angels going down and up, he said, God is in this place and I did not know. The sense, a recognition of the holiness of the moment. And I try to keep that in mind when I'm with my granddaughter, that we sometimes, the sense of presence and mindfulness is perhaps the greatest gift that we could give both ourselves and our grandchildren. The sense of that when we're with our grandchildren, God is in that place with us, and, you know, to keep that in mind. So that's what I think about a lot. You know, if you don't like scream and make a big deal, you know, act out in shul, you have a sense of kind of reverence. And I think we need to have that reverence in the moment when we're with, and especially now when seeing them can be so difficult.
For anyone else on this call, is there any piece of advice that you've given yourself over the years that has just helped you, in your relationship with your grandkids or great grandkids? Yeah, it's David.
It's not a piece of advice. I'd like to ask David, what is the role of the parent? So there's the grandparent, the grandchild, the role of the parent in facilitating the communication between the two. Because there are certainly, whether it's in movies or stories or in personal lives that we've seen, some parents are very good at that, and some parents want to keep that at a distance. Do you have any wisdom on that, on the parents' role in not mediating, but making the connections better, facilitating those connections?
It's a complicated question because there's a lot going on there.
I know. That's why
When we ask grandparents what's the most difficult thing for them, they say, well, it's negotiating relationship with the parents. And when we ask parents what's most complicated for them, and that is that their grandparents get in the way. So I think the truth is, I think it all begins with a sense of mutual respect. My daughter and my son-in-law are the decision makers when it comes to my granddaughter. They don't want to, if they decide not to bathe her for 2 weeks, that's their choice. If they decide to put on one purple shoe and one red shoe, that's their choice. If the parents of a son decide not to have a bris, we may really be pained by that, but ultimately that's their choice. So we need to honor their role as parents. Conversely, and I think once we do that, conversely, they also come to honor us in the roles that we can play. So I would turn the question around maybe, and as a parent say, rather than what's the role of the parent, I would say to parents to be mindful of our role and to be respectful of parents' roles. When you ask, like my sister, who's an early childhood educator, when grandparents can contradict parents, and obviously, and basically the answer is not very often. You really have to honor parents and the roles they play as gatekeepers. Having said that, we know that about 20% of grandparents report having difficult relationships with their children and grandkids. That's to say that intergenerational family dynamics gets in the way. So I would say to grandparents, and I did this with my daughter, I would ask her everything. Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? And she would say, Dad, you don't have to ask me every time. I said, I'm going to ask you every time to build a culture, a relationship of trust. You're the boss when it comes to Bina. Bina's my granddaughter. So I don't know if that's exactly the answer to your question, but that's kind of what we're finding.
Are there any other things that are coming up for you that you want to ask David while we're here? I think that's such an important question. Kathy.
So I just wanted to add to that, David. My David and I have said to all of our children when grandchildren begin appearing on the earth, we want to assure you that we will not intervene, we will not advise unless there's blood. Or if we can see that blood is going to happen, if there's going to be bad things going on, unless they ask for our advice or an intervention. So we say it in a joking way, but it's really true.
I think that there's so much here about trust, like what does it mean to actually trust our children, your children, and your grandchildren? What does it mean for parents to trust their parents, and also to have faith that the relationships, there will be new openings, if things feel closed. I really encourage you. I'm so happy that we've had this time to be together, because I wanted you to know David and his colleagues at the Jewish Grandparent Network, and Lee and the whole group, just to also know the resources. And for those of you who want, we'll definitely be happy to share, or you can look up online, jewishgrandparentnetwork.org. .org, and sign up for their newsletter and see what's going on there, because there's a lot of opportunities and opportunities to have these real conversations. It's not all roses and stuffing and pudding. I'm trying to use some Thanksgiving metaphors here, or food items, but it can be rocky at times. But the potential, in the most entrenched relationships, there's so much also potential for movement and for growth and for becoming, really.
If you want to see how not to do it, watch The Crown.
Oh, don't get Joel Berkowitz started. What do you think?
Read Genesis, one or the other. Or read the story of Jacob blessing Ephraim or Manasseh, or Ruth, in her grandchild. So, but certainly The Crown is there. I just want to. So our website is jewishgrandparentsnetwork.org. We do have a Facebook group. You're welcome to join. Just go to Facebook and type in Jewish Grandparents Network. You will find us. And my email is david@jewishgrandparentsnetwork.org. And I love talking to people, because that's where we learn the most. So if folks want to reach out and set up a time for call, it would be delightful.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want to just end. I want to read this last piece in this chapter on grandparents. Our grandparents are our greatest teachers. So many of us get caught up in the day-to-day tasks, joys, and struggles of being parents that we lose focus on what's important. Among all of this, connecting to grandparents can give us clarity. In the close view, our experience is like the tide, rolling in and out and constantly moving. But in the long view, when we cast our eyes toward the horizon, we see something steady and beautiful. And our grandparents see the long view. They teach us that what endures is connection, strengthened like a muscle, sinew after sinew, visit after visit. Invite your children, your parents, and yourself to practice strengthening this muscle, even when you may feel fatigued. In the end, this is a muscle that will last. And I really bless us all to continue to strengthen these muscles of connection, these muscles of listening, of trust, of faith, these muscles of love, really. And we're coming to the end of our time, and I'm so happy that you all joined and you made the time. And I'm so grateful to David and for all of his work, for bringing the wisdom and beauty of grandparents to the forefront of the Jewish community and the Jewish community's consciousness. And really grateful also to my aunt and my dad and my sister, and the Friezes and the Cullens, and Phyllis Aben, and Ellen and Stuart and Rita, and everyone who is here. That really, it's the network and the tight weave that holds us all together as we continue to raise the next generation of people and of souls. So thank you all for coming, and we wish you a very happy Thanksgiving and a Shabbat Shalom, and we hope to be in touch soon.
Thank you, Dasee. This was great.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.
Great job,
Great,
Dasee.
Dasee. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Really
so much.
enjoyed it. Thank you.
Love to everybody. Love to everybody.